Okay, everyone, this is the Equal Justice Podcast. My name is Anthony Costello, and the Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. Boy, I hope we're not making ourselves sound bigger than we actually are with that motto, but it is a good motto, and we are trying to do that. I'm joined tonight by Dr. Jacob Daniel.
Hey, hi, Tony.
And not yet doctor, but someday, Logan Zeppieri.
Maybe one day.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I'd love to say that we're just going to do theology proper tonight and talk about arguments for the existence of God. But we have another continued hot button, ongoing cultural issue that is not subsiding or going away, but that is, I'd say, ramping up. As we, tonight we're going to talk about how we are seeing manifested before our very eyes the theory of critical race theory that, goes back a good 30 or 40 years. And we've been reading the scholarly material and commenting on some of the scholarly material. But today we're going to talk about how we're seeing it made very concrete in the culture, as we were invited to go to a meeting at a local church in Orange County, California, with about, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 parents that were there, very concerned parents about a new California state public school K through 12 curriculum that has been accepted and will be implemented. And Jacob, you'll clarify this, but for us. But part of that curriculum has been devised and disseminated by our good friends, and I say that with great irony, at the Southern Poverty Law Center, which some of our audience will be familiar with. And we can talk a little bit about that group as we go through here. But this curriculum, guys, we went through parts of it, and we looked at especially the part that was devised by the SPLC, which the four domains of pedagogy that they are going to introduce into all classes all the way down to kindergarten are entitled identity, diversity, justice, and action. So obviously the terms themselves are right out of, or seem to be right out of, the Social Justice Critical Race Theory Handbook. But Jacob, why don't you start us off with what you saw. Give us a little bit of the background on how we got invited over there, and some initial thoughts on this new curriculum and the resistance to it that was encouraging and that we saw last Tuesday night.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So recently, about 1,000 educators, parents, and community members submitted a public petition, a kind of their comments, asking the California State Board of Education to remove all critical race theory references and using it as a pedagogy, as you mentioned, within the California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, which was passed in March, actually, unanimously by the California State Board of Education. Now, woven within this curriculum is at least like 90 direct or indirect references to critical race theory. So the parents were really concerned as to why this is being adopted within the curriculum. And they raised their concerns. And as part of parents' board, they brought it before in forms of testimonies before the board, wanting it to be reconsidered. So what's happening now is actually a lot of parents took on themselves to do all that they can to bring their concerns with the general public, even all the parents in the school as well. So some of the parents were distributing these flyers asking, can we get some help? We want people to come together and raise their concerns, and do it more critically and in a thoughtful manner. So I somehow reached out to one of the organizers, because I received this flyer through a friend of mine, and they contacted us asking us if we could be available to help them in some way. And that's why I reached out to our team here, and we went and we were part of this private group where, as you mentioned, Tony, about 150, 200 parents had gathered together. And I think we had a very productive time there, helping these parents to understand the details in terms of how this ideology is taking inroads within the school system, even at the level of like kindergarten to 12th grade, as you mentioned. Now, this particular school district is being offered a social justice standard. And as you mentioned, it is developed by Southern Poverty Law Center. And there is going to be a voting to pass it on May 11th, right? So these parents are really concerned, community members, grandparents. So they all came together to somehow mobilize, to create a movement where they can actually give their perspective on this very curriculum. So to our listeners, I would also say that it's not just limited to this one district here. It's actually happening around the country. Like this Monday, Idaho's state Senate passed a bill, which is already in the state house, banning the teaching of CRT in school. The bill is HB 377, and it is being sent to the governor, Brad Little, for his signature. Likewise, I recently actually was interviewed by the state representative in Texas, Steve Todd, who has proposed a bill, a similar bill, HB 3979, in the House in Texas. So there is definitely a movement. Parents are gathering, parents are concerned, because early on, they didn't understand what CRT was, but as they are seeing how it is informing the curriculum and they're reading these curriculum, or at least presentations on these curriculum, their eyes are being opened and they're concerned, and they want to be prepared to combat it within the school system. So that's why we offered our help, and we were there, and we connected with a lot of parents, got some really good feedback. I hope it will bear some good fruits.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I was encouraged by what I saw, and I will mention for the audience, because one myth we want to absolutely dispel is that critical race theory is something that if you are of a certain race, you have to be on one side of it or the other. Because the group that we saw Tuesday night was ethnically diverse. Admittedly, probably everybody there was a Christian of some sort or denomination, but equally distributed, probably more women than men, but a good amount of men there, and black, white, Hispanic, Asian, you name it. So
not just on the panel, even
not just on the panel, but in the audience. So we have to really understand this isn't an ideological battle. It really is. And we hope and think that we are on the side of truth when it comes to this ideology. And that's why we've been arguing this. So, and I do think also, Jacob, I'm seeing additional evidence of resistance to critical race theory, not just in the schools, but in the culture generally. We keep seeing more and more stories being broken by various news sources. Obviously, the big name ones are trying to keep it covered up, but they're getting out there anyways.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that phone call conversation that was recorded in New York and we can link to that. It was at some kind of Christian school, where they really exposed how both the administrator and the teacher actually felt about the social justice training and how horrible it was. But, the administrator just didn't have really the guts to do anything about it. But we'll link to that conversation. It was all over the news. Logan, let's go to you. I feel like I'm moderating. I'm not supposed to do that, but
no worries.
What did you see on Tuesday night? And tell us about your excellent quotation of Chesterton. at the very end.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Yeah, so the panel was great. I mean, I've sat in on a lot of these different panels, not necessarily on the panel, but in the more political context, if it's school boards, if it's with congressmen and stuff, just with my background working in politics, not necessarily being on the the civilian side of things, but being there on behalf of different representatives at the state and or being there on in support of some of the congressional individuals on behalf of the state representatives. And so it was lively, like most of them. I mean, you get a lot of these people into the room. A lot of them want to be there addressing a concern that they have in hopes that they can be given some form of to-do list. Like if I can do these 3 steps, then we can see some sort of correction. And those tend to get pretty lively. The quote that you referred to came at the end of the panel, towards the end of the panel, not at the very end, where I don't want to say a conflict. There was definitely a disagreement between.
We should probably talk about this. There were 2 folks up on the panel who clearly were presenting a different approach to the problem.
Yes, and how they were describing it was very different and came to a somewhat of a confrontation. You had, I don't remember the individual's name, but he was maybe the president or maybe the regional director of mass resistance.
The regional director, I think.
Regional director,
mass
okay.
resistance, which has been it's a group that's been around for a long time, and that has done a lot of advocacy. Right.
Yes.
I'm
not very familiar with a lot of their history, their background, outside of what he said before our panel Q&A. In his presentation, he gave a lot of things that they've done and the conflicts they've helped advocate on and get results on. And so it was him, and then Jeff Barkey. I know him. He was an individual that when we talked to the parents, the organizers before the event, I had said, hey, I know someone that is familiar with the school board, has connections within there just because of his career background. You should probably invite him. He ended up showing up. This is Jeff Barkey. And they ended up disagreeing on the kind of advocacy that you should be doing. The side on mass protest had made a comment. I think this is what got Jeff going, and me, I kind of took a step back. He said, if the left is doing these sorts of things, the protesting at political figures' homes, the going after them in their private lives, then why aren't we doing this? We need to start doing this and really put the fire to these politicians' feet.
Sort of get people on the school board and stuff when they were outside of their quote unquote comfort zone.
Yeah, if they're out getting gas or at the grocery store, if you identify them, confront them.
Yeah.
And he had linked it to similar things the left was doing. It wasn't clear that he was saying do what the left was doing. He kind of said, if the left is able to operate in this space, why aren't we operating in this space? So there was a little bit of ambiguity there.
Right.
Jeff jumped on and said, we can't be doing things like the left is doing. We have to be fundamentally different, and we have to win and lose on those principles. And so there was a back, and then he said, the master said, I obviously disagree, I jumped in with the quote from Chesterton, which was something to the effect that it was like the mark of a true soldier is that he goes to combat not for those whom he hates in front of him, but for those whom he loves behind him. And the point I was trying to get across was that the motivation for how we confront our politicians is going to go a long way in determining what kind of solutions we'll find and if those solutions will be followed all the way through. And I had said that if you're going to the school board meeting, if you're going to these politicians in their private lives because you hate the policies they're passing, you hate them individually, you want to see the public school fail, it sets up the conditions for which the solution is just going to be more combat and more, kind of digging in. I said, if you do, in some of the situations may look similar from the outside, but if you go to these school board meetings because of your love of your child, because you think what's happening is harming them psychologically, which a lot of the people in the audience afterwards expressed, that was their main concern. Some of them were school administrators saying, we're teaching your kids to hate.
The gentleman from mass resistance, to his defense, I think his aggressive posture was certainly out of a concern for children. fundamentally. He kept saying, this is what they're indoctrinating our kids with. We can't be, we got to be aggressive. We got to be in their face. And so it did seem born out of, at least in part, the protection of those behind you. The question maybe then would be, did it look a little bit too much like it was also a hatred of the enemy in front of you? Which maybe that's what sort of set Jeff off a little bit, and he wanted to
make just a clear distinction, because ultimately, I mean, this is what we said, is that we believe that they're all fundamentally equal.
We don't know. It just,
no, we don't. There was enough ambiguity and there was a conflict that I was like, I don't want to leave it there as a divided panel, but be able to say, because at the end of the day, we're all on the same side in a way, that we do have concern for our kids. We do want to see things changed for the benefit of the kids, to produce individuals in a society that understand that we are all fundamentally equal, and it's not by racial lines that we're going to classify and impute sins on. But I wanted to at least make the case that for the case in Barkey's argument, and in the case for the individual from mass resistance, and for the parents, that the love of your kid is going to be what needs to motivate you to do whatever action you do, because those are going to that has to set the terms for what success looks like. If success means I defeated this politician, then the question obviously goes to, well, what happened to the kid? Like, the entire fight started there. It should at least resolve with, did the kid benefit from it, or did the kid get a better education resulting from the conflict? It really has to be the guiding lines.
I think the parents also felt the tension with regards to how, even within the presentation that was made by one of the panelists, right, early on, which kind of showed that there was an intentional effort to distance somehow parents from their involvement in the kids' education or what they were learning. Even calling parents as caregivers, not as parents.
I actually want to get back to that point about caregivers. They bring that up. I want to, because I want to get to this. What I think was, there were two, what I saw in that diversity, in that curriculum, the one that designed, that were, for me, I think for all of us, just set off major sort of like alarms. Any of us who have studied an iota or a modicum of history, right? But I wanted to say, with regards to the approach, before we get to that, because what the woman said about why are the schools calling us caregivers and not parents. So I'll put that over here for a second. The approach part, where there was some conflict between Jeff Barkey and the gentleman from mass resistance, which the gentleman from mass resistance came back and said, look, this is what a lot of whites said to Martin Luther King Jr. back in the civil rights. Don't get too feisty. Don't get too, aggressive. Just keep it moderate, right? And he sort of fired back with that, which was interesting. There might be a point there. I do think, Logan, there's a way to sort of embrace, because we're at this place in time. We're far down the line now.
This is what I wanted to bring up, though, and this may have been lost just in how quick the point was passing. But say if you're confronting your politician at the gas station, right? The left, or the people who've embraced critical race theory, are going to do that out of resentment. You should be able to do it out of love.
Yes.
And I think there's this undercurrent that if you love something, you just let it happen, which is not a definition of love that's been held by, I think, any serious thinker for any amount of time. Now, how that cashes out into civil disobedience or spiritual disobedience, or whatever, however you want to cash that out, might be different. But the idea that love is just being agreeable is not correct. It can result in a lot of the same actions. I mean, a soldier could go to battle because they want to see someone else die. That's not, I would say, super uncommon and rare. Or someone can go to battle because they honestly believe that they're protecting their family. I think that that's an important distinction to make, and something to constantly reaffirm.
Maybe I need to bring up a personal example here that might make it concrete. Okay, from what I've seen, the hatred of an enemy comes sometime after you're already on the battlefield. After you've already engaged with the enemy, there seems to be a turning point in the life of some soldiers where it goes from protecting your homeland, protecting your country, pro patria mori, the principles of your country, to now this enemy has hurt me. I've seen him kill my comrades in arms. Now it's moved from protection of the innocent to revenge and hatred of the enemy. So it's something that we have to be constantly aware of as Christians, because at some point we may very well see some very wicked people do very wicked things to us and those that we love. And there we are still called to not give up or give in, but resist in a loving way, right? So that's not going to be easy. I'm not saying that's easy. And Jacob, back to this point that the woman brought up about where the school district is not even calling parents, using the term parents anymore, but only caregivers. One could see how one could get angry about people who are doing that. And the reason, and I don't know if it was explicit in the thinking of all the parents, they just know it intuitively. Wait a second, I'm more than a caregiver. I'm the mother. I'm the father, right? Part of my identity is in this other person called my child, right? I'm just not like a nurse or a nanny. And I think this is where one of the most frightening things about this diversity, even though it's couched in very lovely, flowery moral language, is this idea of the taxpayer-funded school system, public schools, being intimately involved in the creation of a child's identity.
Yeah.
This sounds to me like a draconian kind of move.
Yes. And I think parents are rightly justified in objecting to that, right? So I think what they're feeling is that Caesar is crossing the jurisdiction that he is not supposed to. Why do you say so? So we are called to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but it feels like Caesar is now asking parents to render their children who bear the image of God. Right?
Something not unheard of in
Yes.
in major cultures throughout human history.
Exactly. So I think parents are stepping in, realizing that there is definitely going to be a rift that is being created between them and their children, even through the, as you say, it's been done lovingly. It seems like the curriculum kind of like brings everyone together and informs. But you touched on something very important. Is it the role of the school to help children identify their personal identities? That's a big question to ask. And that was one of the key things, even in this curriculum, right? Not just identify, but also a kind of like justifying the identity that these kids who are still developing psychologically, physically, emotionally, mentally,
Right.
that they can come to an identity of their own. And doesn't matter that it is not brought in light of the truth that is there, right? But in light of their subjective feelings.
Right.
And justifying that.
Yeah,
And
and
doing so, creating so many individual identities that no one can actually stand together. The very purpose of education is not merely to identify who one is, but in light of the truth, who we are.
and to learn.
And to
You know,
learn.
And the other thing we should point out, this is not like, just for the older people in our audience who watch this is not bringing the kids under a common identity of like Americans. We're all American. There's nothing in there about we're all Americans. Now maybe that individual school teacher's going to do that, and they're still going to do the Pledge of Allegiance, so that all of these identity bundles can at least come under the auspices of an overarching identity for the classroom of all Americans. But one would wonder at this point, because you said it really is about developing almost, I'd say, you want to say indoctrinating, but minimally it's about, this exploration of all these various identities that kids might have. Now we've seen tremendous abuses of this.
Yeah, definitely the purpose of education is being abandoned, right? The very project of education should be truth-seeking, truth discovering. But what's happening here is we are engaging in truth-making process.
Stoking the fires of children telling, basically determining the truth.
And the irony is that it's not just limited to these kids finding their identity, but also that they have to raise questions about the other kids when they feel threatened, and not just that, bring that to the authorities and inform them about what other kids are doing to their personal identity.
And that was the second thing we have to emphasize for everybody who watches this video, because the two things that all of us just immediately, one, the identity question. Now you're going to have conflicts between identities, because the Christian kid has an identity that says X, and the LGBTQ kid has an identity that says Y. Now you have a conflict between these two, what these different identities say. Who or what's going to adjudicate over that is a question. But what was definitely being pushed is when children feel that their identity's been threatened, or that they've seen something or heard something, even from a family member. One of the examples is an Uncle who talks, who uses racist language, drops Susie off at school. Susie goes and reports how uncomfortable her uncle's language made her feel in the car.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to point out, is that when you read through the example in the the outline of the curriculum, the example they use, this is applying, they don't make it clear that it's even racist language. It's just negative language. And it's not, obviously there's a distinction. You shouldn't be making strictly negative comments about a particular kind of race. But it's interesting that it's not racist language, is the first part. Second part is it's negative to the identity. And the third part, as you're bringing up, the resolution was going and telling your teacher, and then your teacher calling the family and sort of adjudicating the problem within the family.
And that's another way of crossing one's jurisdiction.
And
entering into someone else's.
Right. And what I don't think, and this is just part of the more fundamental problem of how the fabric of our culture has changed over the last 50 or 60 years. As we know, one of the tenets of the Enlightenment that is now deeply rooted in our collective, social imaginary is the Rousseauian idea that human beings are born good, born free, but everywhere in chains, right? And this idea is that children are good, they're innocent. But what's going to be cultivated, well, we know obviously that human beings are born sinful and corrupt. So what these children are going to be trained in, as Jacob said, identifying negative things and reporting, where the negative things is not based on truth, it's based on feelings. Okay? So we're cultivating an entire generation to basically be tattletales, to put it lightly, informers, to put it in more adult language. When I grew up in Catholic school, we saw some kid on the playground doing something bad. He pushes Joey or whatever. We go to Sister so-and-so. I saw, Joey push Johnny on the playground. First thing Sister so-and-so does, why are you tattletaling? All right? There was a moral lesson for the informer, right? There was a moral lesson for them not to get too comfortable with pointing out other people's flaws and reporting on them. But of course, then the sister would go talk to Johnny as well, who pushed Joey down or whatever I said. So there was moral lessons for both. Right now, it's like the encouragement is find other people's flaws. All right, even if whether they're flaws because they're breaking an actual moral law or not is irrelevant. Just find anything you feel is negative and tell us all about it. That is a very different shaping of a child's soul.
The goal is no more to actually promote virtue. Now, that used to be the essence of the whole educational project, that we create as a society virtuous citizens who would have some common foundation to promote goodness, truth, and beauty within their own culture, right? Within the society that they were part of. But that's not the end anymore. There's one more thing, Logan, I think you pointed out, and I would love for you to actually speak more on this. And this was an observation based on this outline that we had of the curriculum, that it talked about identity, diversity, justice, and action, but no talk about essential equality, right? And I think you made that point very well. So maybe our listeners will benefit a lot from your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I made this comment during the panel discussion at the end of the, I guess, meeting with the parents. But the comment was something like this, that they refer to equity or fairness almost 30 times within the curriculum, but they don't refer to equality in the terms of fundamental human equality even once. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to give the parents is just it was a large scale shift that may have gone unnoticed, that the concern no longer is about fundamental human equality. The question is about what is the fair outcomes? How do people identify, and how do we kind of change the cultural situation such that we're no longer caring about what we think is most valuable? And this is what the parents kept talking, and some of the other panelists brought up, like, we need to ask, are these our values? Are these our values? And I think this is why we feel kind of this void. It's okay, but we need to articulate those values. One of those values is that we're fundamentally equal, and that's a value that was not talked about at all. And that becomes concerning because, as Tony pointed out, when you start talking about identity formation, the question is what's fueling the identity formation? And right now it's this sort of intersectionality. You're this kind of person, you're this kind of person, you're this kind of person. Group those together. We're going to celebrate that, right? But if there's no underlying fundamental human value or fundamental human identity in that value, the question then becomes, what practical resources do we have to say that we're not going to resegregate people along identity lines? Now, they can sit there and say, oh, that's not what we're preaching, that's not what we're preaching. The question is, okay, but why would this not result in fundamental segregation? Because you're not teaching fundamental human equality. Or if you are, it's not in your curriculum, and it's not being demonstrated.
Yeah, and I think this is a great strategy, and one we could actually recommend it to anyone listening to us, that question these very ideas. I would say that we need to highlight the essential human dignity, essential human worth and equality, and ask questions, even with regards to identity, diversity, justice, and action. The question to be asked is, by what standard and to what purpose? And those two questions are not at all discussed here, right? It's just being offered as a framework without asking where are we drawing the foundations from for these ideas, as well as where is it going to lead us to? Yeah. And those two questions are important questions to be asked, especially with regards to these changes.
I would add to that parents just say, what role does why are public schools thinking that they should be involved in my child's identity development anyways, unless it's like, yay, we're part of the Orange County Mustangs, or, the Whittier High, Chieftains or Jaguars or something, fine. But with regards to, the role of identity formation, if one is a religious person, that is the providence of the church or the synagogue or the mosque. If you're non-religious, it's the family. So, this idea that the public school plays this role, I don't think it's a role the public school was ever meant. That identity and virtues are not identical, right? For training and virtues, yes, knowledge, of course, but
this is where I've talked to you about this over the phone, Tony, and I've mentioned this to some of the other individuals in my church, but there's been a shift in how we understand identity. Originally, identity was something you were fundamentally, despite any passing or transient properties or causes or situations and contexts. There was something that made you a human being, and there was a search for what that was. we've subtly shift that. And I think it first started with this idea of I am gay. Now, and it's not the fact of being gay, it's the idea that a sexual act somehow changes what you are fundamentally. That's what's the undercurrent. And once that was accepted as identity forming, then the question becomes, why not the rest? Why not the idea of your skin color is now identity forming? Why isn't it not the sports that you're playing is also identity forming? Why is it, being part of the Mustang Club? There was a point in which that wasn't your identity. Like, that's just these things you did. These are habits you formed. These are how friendships are developed. But that wasn't who you were fundamentally, because if you're no longer part of the Mustang Club, it wasn't like you became a lesser human being. Right. You might have one less activity, but you didn't become a lesser human being.
So it seems like, and I will get a little theoretical here, something like a bundle theory of properties.
This is something I brought up to you that I was thinking, like, maybe this could be it. I don't know enough about trope and bundle theory to say this is where it's at.
But it's certainly not a substrate theory.
And it's not a substantial form theory.
Human form or substrate that persists
human nature
over time,
or something.
A human nature. I mean, we got to obviously here for the Christians who are watching us. Unfortunately, these people are not working with like a Thomistic metaphysics or anything, or even Aristotelian metaphysics, which we'll have to do something on this a little more technical aspect on it. But I think the way, and after reading this Angela Harris essay, and Angela Harris was a critical race theorist. I can't remember it's an older article. It was one that was linked in Nathan Cartagena's paper, where she's arguing against feminist essentialism. She's arguing against essentialism of pretty much anything, but that there's no such thing as the woman's voice, because you got to then break it down. Well, there's black women, there's the black, but then and at some point, you almost feel like you get down to you got an individual. It's sort of hyper experientialism. Everybody just is this bundle of experiences, and that is their identity, which you can almost break it down to is everybody is just a bundle of the sum total of all their mental states. Okay.
It seems like you might be like, people have differences, but the curriculum is assuming that's the case, that the bundle of group identities or group associations is the identity. Right. And Christians fundamentally disagree.
Sounds a little metaphysical or a little theoretical, but this is how it's being handled in these concrete curricula. And the children are a bundle of these identities, and it's now going to be the school's job to manage those identities for them.
Yeah. And it's important to bring this up. I know it's theoretical, but it was very telling when we had like a little Skype call with some of the organizers beforehand. And one of the parents, I think, said something that was, I don't know, maybe more profound than she intended, but it was an expression I think that was very accurate. She said, they're using language we're familiar with, but it doesn't mean what we think it means. Yes. And it doesn't mean the things that we used to think it means. And she commented about this like language being robbed. And this is why we have to get to the theoretical, because if you don't have the theoretical foundation, words just sort of float around and you really don't know how they're being applied or what they mean or what they're referring to. And you have to fight for that.
And this
to make sure they have meaning.
Problem in the church and with many of our pastors who are kind, good-hearted, pastoral individuals, but they don't really have a good grasp of language and how it works, and they don't have the sort of theoretical, philosophical, and theological training to sort of discern these major shifts in how language and words are being used. They don't.
Now, Tony, I would love to actually quote you here, and in one of your articles, and you said it so well, and I would like to actually
I'm going to get quoted in our own podcast.
You've been quoted. So I would like to read this, and you said it so well. The reason is simple. They are interested in the training of social behavior. It is social engineering in its purest form, because it has abandoned any hope that truth can be known or discovered. Education is morphing into a political program. The human person is reduced to a purely political organism, a creature whose sole purpose is to act as an agent of sociological change through persistent structural revolution to bend society towards its own will.
Wow. Who wrote that again? That's great.
You did. And I think you touch on the nerve there, the very idea that you discussed, that there is this assumption of human nature being like blank slate. It gets corrupted by the system. So somehow you have to change the system, right? And in doing so, what you do is you actually do it not by convincing the other, not by engaging in critical thinking. It is basically will to power.
Sheer act of the will.
Exactly.
At the end of the day.
Yeah.
There's some, what? I want to get to, that's good. I want to get to one other thing. Logan, go ahead. But before we finish, there's one other, I think, as I read through some of the scholars, there's one other, I think, fundamental flaw that I have in critical race theory that I haven't heard anybody point out yet. But Logan, start and finish your thing.
Okay. And I'll make this super quick. And this comes down to, I think, a problem that when we formed Equal Justice was kind of in the forefront of our minds, is the ability to move almost seamlessly between the theoretical and the practical, back and forth. And you'll see that in the case with this individual who said, we have similar language, but it doesn't mean the same thing. You see there's an inability to move from the practical to the theoretical. But what this critical race theorists, or even the individuals who are defending this curriculum, they would say things like, oh, well, we're being accused of white shaming, and that's not what we're doing. So what they've done is they've retracted from the practical to the theoretical and says, where in this curriculum does it say that? And you go, well, what you do say is that you need to identify the traits of the dominant group. Of course, we can ask a more practical question. Then what is being identified as the dominant group? And then we have to discourage that. Well, what kind of way are you discouraging that except saying that is wrong in a form of shaming? And so they're oscillating between the theoretical and practical all the time.
Yeah.
And unless you can get a handle of both, they're just going to keep doing that. Like, we're not white shaming. Where does it say that? You go, well, answer the questions. What is the dominant culture? And how are you going to discourage the dominant culture's behavior, which happens to be white, and you're going to do it through shaming? Right. And then you can ask more final, why are you doing that, and so on and so forth. But
why should it be shamed? Why should it be discouraged?
Yeah.
What if okay, so because I have that Kenneth B. Nunn article floating through my head, which I just wrote 2 essays on, and Logan, we're going to get to that a little bit more when we finish up Nathan's papers. But you'll know, if you go back to the scholars who are doing the theoretical work, you'll know what they mean by the dominant culture and these features of that culture and why it all needs to be undermined. And then you'll see that it's not just tweaking the system, it's taking the foundation completely away so that the whole thing crumbles down.
And that's where, even when you read through those scholars, like I was telling you, I'm like, they keep referring to Western European, they keep saying this and that, and so on and so forth. But when you step back and go, okay, but what are they identifying? It seems almost like they're just identifying Western European Christianity. That's what it comes down to. They'll say it because they're not attacking, Gaelic views or Druid pasts or anything like that.
Well, that's where I think this is all ultimately going. If we were to start getting more biblical here at this point, spiritual, Romans 1:32. And I just wrote this article that I think what this really opens the door to is a return to pre-colonial, not just pre-colonial, but pre-Christian religious belief and practice and the cultures that were extant prior to the missionaries, not the missionaries coming. Mm-hmm. So you want to talk about, and when you see, and we'll link this article from, that goes back to Christopher Rufo, but it was a National Review article on prayers to the Aztec war god in a Los Angeles County school, asking the Aztec war god to give children, asking them to give them the strength so they can be social justice warriors. So now you have a strange mix of ancient demon worship, basically, if we're coming from a Christian worldview, and Marxism. Now that doesn't seem like a good brew in I'd rather not drink that potion.
Yeah, well, in this critical race theorists will say, where are you getting that information from? And you go, well, what we're asking is, okay, but what happens if this is followed through in its practical and theoretical frameworks? You know, when you're seeing the critique, all we're saying is Western, Euro-Western, Western European, sorry, that was a little more difficult to say, views, but you're like, but what you're identifying is actually just Christian principles. This idea that like laws are universalizable. Well, that doesn't seem to be, you know, anything other than what the Christians in the West European thought, and the idea of laws going back to Rome, and what they're trying to figure out of how laws are practiced and so on and so forth. So they start articulate, and then the vices, you're like, oh, well, you know, these are all the Christian vices that they point out. And you're saying these are, you know, binding us to, you know, white privilege and yeah.
At the same time, on a practical level, if you see the parents who were there, some of them were Asian parents, and they came from a context where they have experienced the outworking of this kind of strategy, right? Where it kind of takes a kind of zealous religious attitude where it's all about destructing that which is old and advancing that which is new. And it is done not just at one level, right? It is done all levels, especially even with the education of the kids, right? And living within that dichotomy of being oppressed and being an oppressor. And they've suffered because of that. That's why parents who were there sharing their experiences, you know, were actually doing it from the level of experience as well, where they have seen that it was not worth living.
Okay, Jacob, you hit on, I think, one of the ways that critical race theorists use a very particular two terms to their advantage: oppressor and oppressed. Okay. And this is where I think, in everything I've read so far, the fundamental error that critical race theorists make in the oppressor-oppressed dynamic is this: they place the moral quality, because let me set it up this way. In the Screw Tape Letters, chapter 21, 22, 20, 21, and 22, C.S. Lewis, who's no critical race theorist by any stretch, says the fundamental axiom of hell is basically this: the stronger consuming the weaker. Competition, he says, is the fundamental axiom of hell. So there is this real problem of oppressor and oppressed, where the oppressor consumes the weaker, right? Leaving nothing behind. He says that's what the devil's only game is he just wants to, you know, consume the weaker, you know, where what God wants to do, right, is he wants to subsume us into his life, but whereby we retain our individuality, right? So that oppressor-oppressed dynamic is there. But this is, I think, the Marxist term. And that's why it's so wrong. The moral quality is placed just in virtue of the difference in relationship itself, the relatio. So if there is a parent and a child, just in virtue of there being a parent who has more ability, more capacity, more responsibility, more authority, and a child who has less, the relationship itself is where the moral quality lies. It's corrupt in virtue of there being a relationship of one who has authority, capacity, ability, and one who does not. CEO and employee, right? Teacher and student, okay? It's the relationship that's corrupt. The problem is that's just false.
Mm.
The moral quality lies in the will of the people who are in those relational positions. That's where the moral quality lies. So on a CRT view, what you have to do is you have to make sure that there are absolutely zero relationships of hierarchy.
Yeah.
There can be no teacher-student relationship. There can be no parent-child relation. That's why we're getting children who get to determine what they want, and the parent has no say, because it's an equal. Everything's got to be. That's the equity part.
I mean, this is basically
saying that the just differentiation.
Yeah.
Is where the moral corruption is.
You know,
on
this
that
is
view, Logan, I don't see how you don't get rid of Christianity. And I know where you're going with this, Jacob, oneism.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't get rid of Christianity, because at some point, the creator and the creature cannot be the same thing.
Exactly.
Not
And
the
you
same
have to
level.
remove all distinctions, right?
Yeah.
You can't work with distinctions. I mean, that wouldn't happen, male and female. You can't work with that. You have to dissolve everything somehow. That's what's becoming the project of education now, in terms of somehow highlighting these differences, creating identities, but in doing so, removing not just individualism, but the individual himself. One of the things that parents should be aware of, every Christian parent who is kind of tempted to adopt these ideas and are willing to let these ideas infiltrate within the curriculum, this is the question in front of them. I know that racism shouldn't be tolerated, but the question is the question of racism a moral question, or is it a pathological question? Right?
Right.
With critical theory, it's a pathological question. It is not a moral issue, right? If you are appealing to a moral framework, you have to then appeal to a moral lawgiver. From a Christian perspective, it's God. We live by God's morality that he offers. Whereas when it's a pathological system or framework, we have to then correct it by correcting the system, right? And so school works as that system that offers its morality upon our kids. So in saying that, what I'm saying is that there is no moral neutrality even in the sphere of education. That's why it is so important and necessary that every parent who is sending their children to schools must step in and learn as much as they can, but at the same time, be advocate of the truth. And especially in these meetings that are there, I would say they should take that privilege of being a voice for the truth and speak in these board meetings. And not just that, one of the strategies I would say is that, and which is so much necessary, is that these parents and community members have to be intentional about positioning themselves in board, within the board. They have to do that. What I'm seeing is that a lot of parents are against these changes in the curriculum, but it seemed like there is this top-down influence whereby their voices are being suppressed. And to counter that, I think there has to be we have to have faithful presence, even among the board, people who are making decisions, right, for our kids. So that's vital.
Yeah. And like, I think this would be more directed to, the audience that's listening, if these are parents, that even if you don't feel comfortable with making the sophisticated, or what seems to be, the sophisticated theoretical argument, the idea that you believe people are fundamentally equal should be able to be made from a podium. And you'll say, I believe they're fundamentally equal. This curriculum is very clearly not concerned and not advocating for fundamental human equality, and that's where I want to stand. If you're concerned that you can't make that argument from the podium, even making the simple argument saying, if you take this curriculum, I'll have to pull my kid out of school and go to a private school or a charter school or look at some homeschooling options. Even if that's the case, and at least making it known that that's the direction you're going, already puts in the minds of the board members saying, oh, there are consequences if we do get this wrong, and they're going to be held to those consequences. So if you don't want to make the argument, just make the preference saying, hey, this is what we're thinking. You're thinking about adopting this curriculum in the same way we're thinking about just pulling our kids out of school and pursuing a different option. That's also okay. I think the main motivation is just don't leave silent. And
that was voiced at the end of that meeting, and it's absolutely necessary. There's got to be mass resistance. Everybody coming together and saying, if you do this, we're pulling not just Mike, but thousands of students are getting pulled out of the school. We'd all love to be able to move in between the theoretical and the concrete as fluidly as you, Logan. But that's hard for most of us. But to anybody watching this who maybe you're getting some of this, but not all of it, but you do have a child in a California school or some other school in a part of the country that's pushing this, you have already spiritually discerned, right, that there's serious issues here. And that's enough to go on. That's enough to get active and to resist and to do what is necessary to stop this from being taught to an entire generation, or maybe even a second generation at this point, just more aggressively, because this has got to it's got to get stopped now. Otherwise, we're going to reap the consequences, and it's going to be ugly. It's going to be ugly.
Yeah, and we even had school. Oh, go ahead, Jacob.
I would say that this is every parent's moment to have a prophetic voice in the culture. If every parent would step in and confront these evil ideas, they would create a future for their children, for future generation, not for their own sake, right? And that's a huge privilege that's been given to every parent. And this is our moment to seize it.
Well, as you guys have been talking here, I do want to say a couple things. One is the point I made about the relations and how CRT says, sees the moral quality or the moral component being in the relations. I don't know that is actually a novel observation. I'm sure hundreds of people have made that observation that are far more intelligent than I, but at least it just struck me recently that is the case. Jacob, the other thing that you've brought up in our conversations is that as we talk about parents being active here, but obviously prepare yourselves in prayer for this battle, because as it was sort of started out with, there's a way we could do this wrong, right? I mean, we could approach this battlefield with, like, as Logan quoting Chesterton, it's hating our opponent, and that is not going to do anything except probably not just win the fight, but we start to lose a little bit of our soul at the same time. So prayer, to prepare ourselves, we need to be coming together as a community, praying together for each other and for how to fight this battle. It is a spiritual battle at the end of the day, and if our spirits are not oriented true north, then we will lose. We will lose on various counts. Now, that being said, prayer so that God can enlighten our minds and strengthen our wills so that we can walk the walk, talk the talk, and get out there and do the work as well. So it's got to be both.
Yeah, it got to be. And we have to not cease to speak truth to power. That's what we got to be doing in all spheres of influence, including in the lives of our children. And I would say it is every parent's responsibility to take charge of the jurisdiction that God has given them and take care of their children, even at home. They need to be prepared right at home as well, while these changes are being brought about. And they can do it not in their own strength, but in the strength of the Lord. And we need to be seeking God's will. But at the same time, God's will motivate us to go where the truth would lead us. And we should be bold enough to do that. So
Amen.
That's what will be my encouragement to the parents and everyone who is involved and concerned about the future generation.
Logan, any final words here to wrap us up?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. I mean, it's been attributed to Mother Teresa, but I think at this point everything's been attributed to Mother Teresa if it's somewhat heartwarming. But there was this quote that something to the effect that, if you want to change the world, first go home and love your family. I think parents are in the perfect situation. And that's what we're called, is you got to start with the things that God has given you. If you're a parent, he's given you a child. For some people that was exciting. For some people that was a scary moment in their life when they found out that was coming. But that's what has been given to you. That's where you're at now. And the way in which your kid is going to be educated is the natural extension of raising your child. And that's who you're called to love first. It's those who are within your family. Those are your immediate neighbors, your first society. And so that's what I'd encourage parents, is that life can be hectic. Everything's pulling for your attention. But ultimately, that's where the changing the world begins, is how is your family functioning?
Tony, if I may also add just one more thing. I would say, whoever you are, just remember that you got allies in people of all color.
Yes.
People of all cultural background and ethnicity. Don't just assume that all because someone looks different from you, they would hold to a different position on this matter. No. there are many, and that was one of the major encouragement for me personally, to see these parents from so many different backgrounds, just speaking for the truth, loving their children, loving them well. And for the sake of that, they're willing to fight.
Yeah. I mean, two of the most fervent voices at the meeting were two black women who spoke with great zeal, probably, of course, wanting to protect their babies and their children from this. So we do have to band together and fight the good fight of faith, and that across every ethnic or gender divide that isn't really a divide anyways, if we would just see ourselves as children of God and citizens of the United States of America. All right, gentlemen. Well, this has been wonderful. We will see you next time on the Equal Justice Podcast.